What's up, y'all? I'm Scott. This is Stringjoy. It's after work. It's rainy. It's cold. I'm sitting here with a Strat unplugged, attempting really badly to play chicken picking, but I'm really awful at it. But hopefully, with enough time and practice, I too will get good at this one thing. But that's not what you came here to talk about. You came here to talk about guitar strings, and I am more than happy to oblige. Today we're talking about whether or not guitars can be meant for a certain gauge of string, what it means when you hear that in different places, whether it's ever the case, whether it never really matters, etc., etc. So there's a couple of different circumstances in which people will talk about how their guitar or a guitar is just like meant for a certain gauge or alloy or type of string. We're going to talk about each of those today and whether or not I think they're valid. This is basically my opinion, so you're kind of going with what I think here. Certainly, if you think that your guitar is just meant for a certain gauge of string, maybe you're right. Who knows? But let's talk about it. The first circumstance I hear pretty often is where people are talking about how a particular guitar was perhaps like designed with a certain set of strings in mind and how it can't really work with any other. The one that comes to mind the most is that you do hear some people talk about how Jazzmasters and Jaguars were just designed for flatwound strings. They won't work with any other type of strings. It's just not the same thing. Now, while I'll admit that it's very possible that like a flatwound string might work well on a Jazzmaster or a Jaguar, I don't think it's fair to say that like they were made for these strings and as such no other strings will work for them for a few reasons. I mean, for one, back when those guitars were designed, people were using round wound and flat wound strings. I know that Jazzmasters were initially meant to be guitars for jazz players, so they probably factored in they might be using flat wound strings. But that doesn't mean that those are the only strings that would work on them. The second thing that I think is most telling about something like this is the fact that most all guitars were designed sort of in the first place back in a period in which people were playing really heavy strings. Like really heavy, like 14 to 60 or something like that. So to a certain point, like all guitars were kind of designed with that in mind. So I think it's a little bit weird to like cherry pick and say that, you know, a given guitar was just designed for flat wounds or designed for 11s or 12s, when in truth, kind of all guitars were, and they all generally work just fine with things like 10s or 9s or 11s or what have you. So I think that this is mostly not like a really valid critique to say that like Jazzmasters just have to be played with flat wounds. Now, all that said, I do have certain preferences and opinions about what I think works well on certain guitars. Jazzmasters, for example, I really love a set of 11s on Jazzmasters. 9s kind of feel a little bit weird to me on there. 10s are all right. 12s get to be a little bit too much. But that's a little bit more about how I want to accentuate or avoid different things about the Jazzmaster that are great or negative. And that just really varies on who you are and what you're looking to make your guitar do. For somebody, you know, the boominess of a Les Paul might be something they want to accentuate and really just like totally dive into that full boomy bottom end. And for other people, they might really dislike that and want to go with a little bit of a thinner gauge string or a stainless steel alloy or something like that to get it to sound a little bit less, you know, boomy and bottom heavy and Les Paul-y. So that is all to say, I don't personally buy this critique. I don't really think guitars were like designed for a certain set of strings in the very first place back in the 50s and 60s, and there's just no way over time for them to work well with a different gauge set of strings. The second and probably most common circumstance in which people will talk about guitars having been meant for a given gauge of string is when you're getting that information from the manufacturer themselves, where the manufacturer will say like, this guitar was set up for a given gauge of string, and that's what we recommend using on it. Now, for whatever reason, I don't hear this critique from electric players all that often. I think that's probably because most electric guitars are set up for 9s from the factory, and pretty much every electric guitarist that I know, with certain exceptions, immediately gets a guitar, if it's new, with 9s on it, and swaps them out for 10s or 11s or whatever. So I think electric players are more just used to the idea that they're gonna have to put different strings in their guitar and maybe adjust a few things to make it work just right. The place that I do see this come up a lot is with acoustic guitarists. I hear from a lot of acoustic guitarists that'll say like, you know, Taylor or Martin or whoever recommends only this gauge set of string for my guitar, and you know, that's the only gauge set I can use. So ultimately, like, this isn't too much of a different thing with acoustic guitars than it is with electric guitars, even though acoustic guitarists, I think, are a little bit more sensitive to it. Any acoustic guitar can work for a variety of gauges. They're certainly, well rated for anything from 10s to 13s, or probably even 14s in many cases, without it having any trouble. The things that are going to always change are just, things that the factory set up in the first place. On electric guitars, intonation at the bridge here is one of the first things that's going to change if you do change your gauge, especially if you change it quite a bit. If you go from 9s to 9.5s, it's probably not a huge deal. If you go from 9s to 11s, you'll probably need to turn some screws a little bit to get everything to intonate just right. The second aspect with electric guitars is things like the springs in your tremolo systems. If you have a hardtail guitar, this isn't an issue at all, but if you do have a trem system, with certain systems like this, there is like a certain point at which the gauges can be too much. On the Strat, for example, I tried to put 13 gauge flatwounds on it recently, and the screws were not having it at all. So that is one thing to keep an eye on. And the other piece ultimately is just going to be your nut. There's a lot of great tutorials on how to widen nut slots. A lot of companies like to cut nut slots super tight. It's actually like a huge pet peeve of mine when it comes to buying a new guitar. Every electric guitar company seems to love, and I don't mean like all of them, but a lot of them seem to love cutting their nut slots for 9s, even though that's what hardly anybody plays, and you have to do work on it to get a set of 11s or 10s to work well on it, which I think is kind of silly. But the same thing is true for electric guitars or acoustic guitars. You might have to widen your nut slot just a little bit to get it to accommodate the gauge of strings that you're most comfortable with. That's totally fine. Even if you go back down in gauge a little bit after that, they're going to work just fine in those nut slots. Personally, I kind of just wish companies would cut them a little bit larger so that you can fit more of a broader range of strings in there. But ultimately, just because Taylor or Fender or whoever says that there is a certain gauge they recommend for their guitar does not mean you can't use a different gauge of string at all. It doesn't even mean the majority of players that own that guitar use that particular string. It just means you might at the front end need to do a little bit of intonation setup or a little bit of nut setup or both, or maybe not at all, depending on how that guitar was set up. So the third and final instance in which I will hear players talk about how a given guitar is meant for a given set of strings is one that I actually think has a lot more legs than the other. It makes me call to mind what Tommy Emmanuel will say, where he'll say like a given guitar, just you have to try a number of different sets of strings on it to sort of feel what feels right, what sounds right on that given guitar, and then over time, a lot of times he'll even try things out again and make a switch because the guitar has sort of changed, or maybe just what he's looking for has changed with the guitar. I think this is actually pretty savvy, especially when it comes to acoustic guitars, but with electric guitars too. I'm very much this way. If I get a new guitar like this little Strat that I got not too long ago, I might play the strings that come on it for a minute. I might go to 10s, might go to 11s, go to 9s, 11.5s, what have you. I might try a wound third, a heavier bottom, who knows. I very much like to try a bunch of different things, and I do a lot of times kind of settle into something that I think is what just works perfectly on a given guitar. Acoustic guitars are especially this way too. A lot of people will get two different acoustic guitars or rather they'll have one, they'll buy another that has a totally different wood on it, and then they'll put the same set of strings on it and find that the strings that sound absolutely like perfect and bring their triple aught to life on a different like mahogany guitar just sound dull and dead and flat. That's normal. Different guitars, especially with acoustics, are made differently with different woods. They resonate differently, and they kind of call for different things. So in this case, I do think it's really appropriate, so long as it's meaning like you're trying out a bunch of different sets of strings, different gauges, different alloys, etc., and finding whatever works perfectly on that guitar for you. But I think it's important to make the distinction there that it's more like you deciding that this is the set of strings that really works for you than it is telling everybody else on the internet or what have you that there's just one gauge that works perfectly for Strats or for Tellys or whatever, because it's all different. All players are different. Some people like 7s, some people like 19s. You do what you can and you play with what makes your playing more fun and more exciting and makes you want to pick up the guitar. So I'm curious y'all's thoughts. Do you hear a lot of people saying stuff like this? Do you have a guitar that you think is just like meant for a given set of strings? What set is it? We'd love to hear all about it down in the comments. Thanks for watching, y'all.